Chapter 21 of 2,000 Miles Below by Charles Willard Diffin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Suicide. Gordon Smith, sometimes known as Smitty, was to remember little of the happenings that followed the crash of the big Army dreadnought. It was Colonel Culver who dragged him from the pilot room wreckage. Colonel Culver and one of the pilots whom he had restored to consciousness. They lowered Smitty carefully to the ground, then explored the rest of the ship. Their hands were red when they returned, and empty. Captain Farrell and the rest of the crew had ceased to be units of the United States Army Air Force. Henceforth, they would only be names on a casualty list grown ominously long. "Stood plumb on our tail," said the pilot, staring at the wreck. "They hit us just once, and the left wing crumpled like cardboard. Last I remember was pulling her up off the trees." He stared at the mass of twisted metal and the center section where the wing had torn loose. It stood upright, almost vertical, resting on the crushed tail. "Funny," said the pilot in the same flat, level tone that seemed the only voice he had since that last pull on a whipping wheel. "Damn funny. Mostly we get it first up there." "Come here," snapped Colonel Culver. "Lend a hand here with Smith. We've got to carry him. And don't talk so loud. Those red devils will be out here any minute." Smitty was taking a more active interest in his surroundings when he sat a week later in the governor's office. "There's a detachment moving in there from the south," said the governor. "We're going to follow your advice, to some extent at least. We're sending troops to Tonah Basin. If the top of that dead crater is closed, they will blast it open. Then a scouting party's going down. Call it a reconnaissance. Call it suicide. One name's just as good as the other. Colonel Culver here is going. But you know the lay of the land there. You could be of great help. How about it?" "Are you asking me?" Smitty inquired. He stood up, flexed his arms, while he grinned at Colonel Culver. "Hinges all greased and working. As a flyer, Colonel, you're a darn good first aid man, I'll say that. When do we start?" Which explains why Smitty, some time later, hidden under the grotesque disguise of a gas mask, was one of 50 similarly attired who stood waiting about the black open maw in the great cylinder-floored crater of one of the peaks that surrounded Tonah Basin. Night. And the big stars that hang so low in the black desert sky should have been brilliant. They were lost now in the white glare that streamed upward. The crater was a fortress. Around the circle of the entire rim, on the inner side of the rough crags, men of the 49th Field Artillery stood by their guns. Lookouts trailed their telephone wire to the higher peaks, where they perched as shapeless as huddled owls, and, like owls, their eyes swept the mountain slopes and the desert at its base, where the searchlight crews played long fingers of light incessantly, and where nothing moved. But the empty silence of the desert was misleading, as the men in the crater knew. They had begun arriving with the earliest light of morning. Smitty had come in with the first lot, and when the first big auto-gyro transport had settled and risen again from the crater, another had taken its place, and another, and many others after that. The first crew had been a machine gun battalion, and Smitty had smiled with grim satisfaction at the unhurried way in which their young captain had snapped them into position without loss of a second, and their guns, Smitty noticed, were trained inward upon the crater itself. Inside that protecting circle, the other transports landed one by one. Men, mobile artillery, ammunition cases, big searchlights, and a dozen engine generator outfits. The last transports brought in strange cargo, short sections of aluminum struts with bolts and splice plates to join them together, blocks and tackle and sheaves, then spools of steel alloy cable at least 10 miles in length. From the last ship they took a hoisting engine and an assortment of aluminum plates and bars, which were bolted together by waiting mechanics, and which grew magically to a crude but exceedingly substantial elevator on which 50 men, by considerable crowding, could stand. Only a floor of bolted plates, with corner posts and diagonal bracing and a single guard rail running around the four sides. But for the first time, Smitty began to feel that he was actually going down, that this was not all make-believe or a futile gesture. He would stand on that platform. He would go down where Dean had gone, and then... But what would come after he knew he could never imagine. A little crane swung the first metal work into position above the shaft. One end of the assembled framework of aluminum alloy dragged loosely on the ground. The other end swung out and projected above the shaft, swayed for an instant, and then came the first direct knowledge of the enemy's presence. The end of a metal strut, though nothing visible was touching it, grew suddenly white-hot, sagged, then broke into a shower of molten, dazzling drops that rained down into the pit. "Good," said Colonel Culver, who was standing beside Smitty. "Now we know they are there. But it means we will have to go down there with our gas masks on." To Smitty, it was not immediately apparent how gas masks were to protect them from the deadly invisible ray. He got the connection of thoughts when a bomb was slid over the edge. The dull thud of the explosion quickly came back to them. "They popped that one off in the air, hit it with their heat ray," said a cheerful voice beside them. "But the phosgene will keep going down. Give them another." The interval this time was longer. "Now for a dirty crack," said the cheerful voice. "Time this one." A youngster nearby snapped a stopwatch as the bomb was released. He held some printed tables in his hand. Odd receivers from which no wire led were clamped over his ears. This time the dull thud was long in coming. It was hardly perceptible when the young man with the stopwatch announced, 50,000 feet, sir." "Give him another. Time it again." A second high-explosive bomb was released. 50,000 feet, sir." "Good. That measures it. And those last bombs have knocked the devil out of whatever machinery they've got down there. Now we'll give them a real taste of gas. Two of the green ones there, men. Put 10 miles of cable on the drums. Get that hoisting frame into place." But night had come. Those searchlights outside the crater and floodlights within had robbed the night of its terror. When Smitty, with Culver beside him, climbed over the guardrail of the lift that hung waiting just over the pit. A gas mask covered his entire face. Through its round eye plates he looked at the others who crowded about him. Grotesque, almost ludicrous. 20 men armed with clumsy submachine guns. The others would follow later. A searchlight was on a tripod at the center, and a spool of electrical cable. The light sizzled into life and swung slowly about. Then the platform jarred, and the spool of cable began slowly to unwind. Beside him, Colonel Culver was returning the salute of an officer outside on the ashy ground. Smitty raised his hand, but the brink of that pit had moved swiftly up. There was nothing before him but a glassy wall. Reconnaissance? Suicide? One word was as good as another. But he was going down, down where Dean Rawson had gone, down where there was a debt to be paid. End of chapter 21.